Okay, people, here's where we start. Mark my words, in about 2 weeks, this is going to look like this. Well, now that the engine and everything is put back in and running and driving in Genevieve, I've got about 2 weeks left, at least that's my target, to accomplish 4 weeks worth of work on Bruce here in the driveway. He's got the engine sitting right behind you. It's gonna get assembled, it's gonna get installed. We'll get wired up, running and driving enough so that it can drive on and off the trailer, and then onward to California. It's gonna be a little bit different working on the cars out there, and boy, am I just enjoying the shadows on my face. It's so interesting with the light coming down. It doesn't matter. Let's get back to work. You may recall from just one episode ago that the front Crossmember I pulled off of the shelf, which was powder coated black with the silver control arms. It's all ready to go inside of Bruce with a few small exceptions. We're going to be using the original springs from Bruce in the front, as well as replacing the steering components. The front Crossmember comes out with 6 bolts, major bolts holding the thing to the frame of the car. I think it was 2 in the front and 1 in the rear, or it's the other way around. We'll see those a little bit later in this video. But they have a little locking tab, which is just like a metal tab that keeps the bolt from undoing itself over time. And there's also alignment. They're little like horseshoe spacers that go in there to adjust the alignment left to right side. Now, after you disconnect the steering components, and I was pretty lucky that they weren't seized in place, you undo the sway bar. This is the IPD sway bar, 25 or 26 millimeters, whatever they were doing in the early 90s. That is kind of untouched from when I bought the car. It is going to go back on. We're going to repaint it and re-grease all the bushings a little bit later. But everything does come down pretty easily. Originally, this video was 1 hour and 45 minutes long. I'm going to try to cut it down as much as I can without glazing over too much, because it's real simple to work on these cars. But there's a few tips and tricks that I'm going to share that'll help you if you're ever changing your Crossmember out. This is a very interesting opportunity to take a look at IPD's sway bar to see how it aged over the years. And what I mean by that is the bushings and the grease and the mounts. Starting with the mounts, this one looks real good here, but then on the other side, it's got a funky twist. You see that? It's kind of coming up from the side over there, so it must be too thin and have exerted a little too much lateral force one day and just bent that over. Or there was some suspension problem that may have damaged it. I can't really tell. Now, the bushings are a little bit bigger on the top side for these old mounts. I believe the new kits, as you get them, have just the same size bushings all over the place. Maybe they realized, you know what, this older, bigger bushing is costing us more, but it's actually got zero benefit versus a standard size bushing, so they started doing just one size for all of it. The other thing I wanted to mention is the grease inside of this is actually still really greasy. It's got a little bit of sand that stuck to it over the years, but it feels almost like new grease, and that's pretty impressive that all these years and potentially decades later, that little grease that they sell you with this still works just fine. These may be IPD stainless brake lines because there were so many IPD parts on this car from, these are probably all from the 90s, if not before then. It doesn't have any markings on it, but it's kind of fun to see. There is no rear sway bar. If there was, you'd be able to see it underneath the differential. I'll drive the car and we'll see how that compares, having the hefty front bar only. I'd be real curious to find that out. This thing comes out with just 6 bolts and then a few connections. One of the big connections right here for the steering linkage. I was very fortunate that it came out with just a few taps, considering how old and potentially rusty this whole thing could be. So I was very grateful for that. Furthermore, not a lot of, just some surface rust here, and on the bottom side you can see the holes. I have a little bit of surface rust. I know it's dark, but everything was sandblasted and painted. I'm gonna just touch those up with some black underbody paint, make sure that I don't have any problems. Our new powder-coated Crossmember here, it looks real nice. Improvements between the two? No, there won't be any. It's literally the same part, just one is already nicely prepped and ready for us, and the other one is unrestored and original, and now just a big paperweight. Really big paperweight, like heavy. Eek. All right, we'll see if it's worth keeping or not. If I've got the time, I'll start taking it apart and boxing it
Otherwise, it's just going to go right into the scrap pile. All right, let's start putting this in.
And when I say it's heavy, I mean it's really heavy. Individually, each crossmember piece doesn't weigh much, but I think the brake rotor is the heaviest of the bunch. I used the lower spring perch after removing the shock absorbers to act as a washer so that I can get the spring compressor in there just enough. It fits quite nicely. A little bit more on that later. I also found out that this did use polyurethane bushings, but they're like the white nylon, or maybe they're not even poly, they might just be straight nylon. Taping the bottom of this to keep it from getting damaged with the jack. The spindles would come off to make it a little bit easier to install, because with one person, nobody to balance this up, it was just going to tip one side or the other and would make it nearly impossible to put in by myself. You may notice that the driver's side lower control arm is missing. I took that bolt out 2 years ago to use on Arthur when his control arm fell out late one evening after a date, like at 2 a.m. So that was an adventurous evening. Thankfully, it was a fix I could do on the street the following day. But I'm going to be reusing that bolt from Bruce's original Crossmember. It went up without a problem, though.
Okay, it's briefing time. Let's see where we are on Bruce. I almost called him Arthur. There's a few parts of Arthur that will live on in this car, and I'm very happy to say that. I got the Crossmember out. It was heavy. The new one's almost in place, and then I realized, you know what, this hardware was really rusty, so I had to spruce up the hardware. But getting the old Crossmember taken apart wasn't so bad. It's actually pretty lightweight in this center section here. There's so much weight in those spindles from the brake rotor, which is also the hub assembly, and the brake caliper as well. Funny thing is, the calipers on this car, you can always check the rubber boots. Always spiders in here too. These calipers are actually in really good shape. They still have very pliable rubber boots, and no doubt they work because this car was taken care of before it was parked. I still don't know why it was parked. There's some funky stuff in the rear suspension. We're going to have to investigate just a bit there.
Taking the spindles apart, pretty simple. I don't need to mess with the bearings at this time because they were resealed not too long ago. But the upper and lower ball joints I am replacing. I've got brand new ones from VP Auto Parts, and they do come with hardware, which is really good. The lower ball joint, just to the right of the WD-40 can, you can see the bump stop. That bump stop shares the 4 holes as the lower ball joint mount, and right here's a better look at the whole thing. I cannot stress enough just how easy it is to work on these cars. It's such a pleasure, really. Volvo made it quite simple, and that's just the 60s for you. Even the strut suspension of a 240 is relatively simple. There's not a lot of sensitivity to the alignment of this front crossmember, but there are those little horseshoe-shaped shims that go in toward, I believe, the rear bolt, where there's just one bolt hole, and it's not that sensitive. If you don't get it right, any shop can put them in for you, and it does affect the caster. That's the relative position of the wheel front to rear, as best as I understand this suspension. At least I hope I got that right. Now, a very important piece between this metal shim and the actual crossmember is a rubber insulator for the top of the springs. Right now we're looking at the crossmember. It is upside down. We're doing a bottoms up view, and you can see the 2 holes that it mounts to the frame here on one side. And this rubber piece was actually very well preserved, and you can see clearly the part number if you do need to order one. For some reason this was missing in the powder-coated crossmember, and I'm not surprised because it would all be taken apart. Because if they powder coated with this thing in place, it would probably have melted. Okay, now this begins our final installation phase, that is to reassemble both sides. At the end of this video, we're going to have all the control arms, the springs, and the spindle assemblies in place with the sway bar attached. I like to loosen the bolts on the lower control arm so that it does move freely, and then I wipe everything down because I like to work with a clean surface. The next thing I do is remove the lower spring perch. It's just those 2 small bolts, and then that gives me the access to put in the modified spring perch, which is just the one I've been using with the spring compressor. I drilled out the hole a little bit so the spring compressor will fit through it. And once that goes up in place, this side I did a little bit easier than the other side, where I first attached the upper control arm and then did the lower ball joint and used the jack to kind of wiggle everything into place just where I needed it. And once it was all said and done, then I removed the spring compressor. On the passenger side, it took a little bit longer because I did it the other way around, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Well, I did this side in 1 hour and 10 minutes. So let's see if we can do the other side. No, let's say about 45 to 50 minutes now that I know the exact procedure. The trickiest thing was just getting the sway bar end links on, because they get real slippery. And we're gonna clean up the grease afterwards. I still need to find the castle nut for the steering arm and replace the bracket for the sway bar on the other side. So hopefully I don't need to undo those bolts on the sway bar on that side, because it was a little bit of a pain in the bum. All right, this one's gonna be a little more involved because I do have to separate the control arm and mount it first. But a loose control arm, that's gonna add 4 minutes. All right, I'm gonna invite you to join me on this side from over here, and we'll see just how many Toto songs it's gonna take to complete our passenger side suspension. Here we go. Wish I had stickier grease, but my regular stuff's gonna seem to work out. Don't want to damage the threads like I did all those years ago, so let's see if I can get the rest of it through. This way. It's aged really well, but it's time for re-greasing, especially with all the sandblasting. Thankfully, sand does not damage rubber, it just bounces right off. The bore is smaller, but I wonder if we can make this work. Your face, but as I fall from this, it results without a day. The coil spring compressor did not come with any washers, so I'm using the lower spring mount from our volunteer Crossmember. It's chewing it up nicely at the bottom, but it's doing the trick and it barely fits inside of the hole in here.
Every time you wake, I can see the smile in your eyes. How long will it take before I finally realize it's time to let you go? All this betrayal, just the way that feels. All this betrayal, just a couple of things that all this betrayal.
I don't want to get the compressor stuck up here, so I want to make sure it's far enough down, not the coil-wise, that when I compress the spring and let it go, it's not gonna get stuck. I think I'm in a good spot. I also don't want it to be too far down, or else you won't get enough compression. But I think I'm in an okay spot.
Bring the noise. The spring compressor is doing a lot of the compressing, but I'm going to use the jack now on the bottom here to take up the gap. Ah, zip tie broke. Okay, I'm going to enlist a longer bolt. I like the way I did it better on the other side, where I bolted it from the top and then jacked up the control arm to meet the bottom of this, because right now it's sort of got this funky pivot point, so that's the way I'd recommend it. Definitely recommend going top down, not bottoms up. Unless you're at a party.
Wow, we managed to do it in 20 Toto songs. That's like an hour and 50 minutes, so thanks for sticking along. Next episode, we're gonna start just rocking and rolling. We've got wiring harnesses, we've got the fuel tank going in and out, and the rear axle, the dashboard. There's a whole bunch of stuff still ahead, and all this madness. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe. Eventually, we're gonna get right to this car running and driving, and I want you to be there for that. See you soon. Oh, you still here? Give this video a thumbs up so other people can see it, and we can keep growing the channel together.